to understand something, I need to build a model. And that's where I think we're making some progress, and I'm going to describe that progress. And I'm going to try to draw some tentative lessons from what we've learned. So I'm just going to start with a few pieces of data. And I want you to think of the situation about 9 months ago. A classmate of mine from Yale, Barry Eichengreen, together with a colleague of his, Kevin O'Rourke, wrote a blog that was the most read, or at least received the most hits of any blog in economics ever written. And what they did was they just decided to look at, here's a picture. They decided to look at a comparison of what had happened in the first months of the recession, the crisis we're currently in, and compare it with what had happened during the Great Depression in the 1930s. So here's a picture. What you're supposed to get from that is when we add up industrial outputs from countries across the world, but especially Europe, the United States, Japan, and compare it with what was happening in a similar group of countries in the 1930s, wow, looks like we're heading downhill. This picture, and Juan Carlos was mentioning that I work a lot on trade. This is a picture that over time I'm going to come back with my students and study a lot, because this is something that's shocking. The fall off in world trade that occurred over the past 2 years is even more dramatic than anything that happened in the 1930s. And so my friend Barry and his colleague O'Rourke said, to sum up, looks like we're tracking or doing even worse than the Great Depression of the 30s, whether the metric is, and they go through a number. I've just showed the two most dramatic. Focusing on the US alone causes one to minimize that fact. Maybe we shouldn't be calling this a Great Recession. Maybe this is a depression. So you can see why this blog is going to be read a lot. Now, this past fall, and they had promised to do systematic updates, but this past fall they stopped because the picture's just not that bad. World industrial output started making an upward tick. World stock markets have made a spectacular comeback. World trade, it's still interesting, and that's going to be something to come back and study. And I'm not going to go through the details on this, but they say, actually, it looks like we're on the way to recovery. We'll talk about the possibility of a double dip recession when we get towards the end, but maybe the new data tells us that we were wrong to be panicking. This was the kind of blog that was certainly feeding the sorts of panic that people were feeling last year. Now, so I'm going to do a little bit of propaganda here. For the last 10 years, we've been running a project at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. And I should mention, since both Dr. Oliu and Professor Conesa mentioned that I'm an advisor at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, nothing I say is meant to represent the views of the bank. This is not official, although they published this and they published the essay that this is based on, but whatever. Because this is certainly not going to be the view of the Federal Reserve Board, what I'm going to be talking about. And so in this project over the last 10 years, Ed Prescott and I and a number of collaborators have systematically tried to go back and study what we define as being the Great Depressions that occurred in the 20th century. And we study some other episodes that don't quite fit our definition of Great Depression, but come close. In retrospect, let me mention, in retrospect, I'll mention what these are in just a second. In retrospect, I think what we should have done, and we'll do in the next version if there is one, is study crises that did not turn into depressions. I'd like to study what happened to Sweden and Norway in the early 1990s. Those are both countries that had their bank systems just totally collapsed. as did Finland. Finland suffered quite a bit more, and the Finns called what they went through a Great Depression. It's not quite bad enough to be what Ed Prescott and I define as a Great Depression, but it comes awful close. It misses by 1.5% of output loss. But I think it was perhaps more interesting to look at crises that didn't turn into depressions. And I think we'd do that some other time. Okay, the history on this was, all this came from a different project at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis that Hal Cole and Leo Hanian did. They were the first people to try to use a simple general equilibrium model to think about the Great Depression in the United States. That inspired Ed and me to organize this conference. That's why I date this as starting about 10 years ago. We edited a special issue of the Review of Economic Dynamics in 2002, and just 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, 6 months before the onset of the current crisis, at least as the NBR dates it, we came out with this book. Perfect timing for book sales. You can get it through Amazon.com if you're interested. Okay, and so what we do is we look at a number of episodes, the big European, North American countries in the 1930s, and then more recent events, a number of events in Latin America in the 80s. That's why the 80s are called the lost decade in Latin America. And then isolated episodes in other places like New Zealand and Switzerland, and Finland and Japan. Although Finland and Japan have gone through very bad experiences, they're not quite as bad as what we call a Great Depression. We call a Great Depression to be a large negative deviation from balanced growth. And we choose a 2% growth trend. And let me just show you the reason, although then I'm going to show you a picture for Spain that's going to cast maybe a bit of doubt on this. Here's the experience of the United States over the last 109 years. This is real GDP per person aged 16 through 65. And the red dotted line is a 2% growth trend. And what I want you to see is that the blue line, the real GDP per person, is actually not too different from the trend line. Business cycle fluctuations, the thing we call business cycle fluctuations in the United States, are fairly small. And what's interesting is we keep coming back to this trend line. Ed and I weren't the first people to notice this. NBR economists started talking about this phenomenon back in the 50s.